Hello. Okay, you guys can hear me. Hi, I'm Sophia Bruckner. I'm an assistant professor from the School of Art and Design, if I haven't met you yet. I also have an appointment in SI, and I'm here once in a while. Dr. Matias studies the governance of human and machine behavior in democracies and works on the very important and difficult issues of preventing online harassment, reducing the promotion of inaccurate news, and managing partisan conflict. He recently finished his PhD at the MIT Media Lab with Ethan Zuckerman, and he is currently a postdoc at Princeton University in psychology and the Center for Information Technology Policy. He directs a nonprofit called Civil Servant that organizes citizen behavioral scientists to test ideas for a fairer, safer, more understanding internet. Before MIT, he worked in tech startups that have reached over 1 billion phones, helped start a series of education and citizen media organizations, and studied post-colonial literature at Cambridge University and Elizabethtown College. He was a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, Digital Ecology's Research Partnership, and the Royal Society of Arts. He also worked at Microsoft Research in the Social Media Collective and Fuse Labs. His many writings have appeared in The Atlantic, PBS, Boston Magazine, and The Guardian. I was lucky enough to be with Nate at the MIT Media Lab at the same time as him, and he's one of the kindest and most generous people I know. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for welcoming me here today. So today's talk is going to range from examples of empirical research I've done to broader philosophical discussions. So I'm excited to take you along for the ride. I probably don't have to do much at all to explain to this audience that we live in a computational culture. One where software and communication systems are a basic part of our everyday lives. Transportation, financial transactions, health, news, political discourse, these are all things that all of you study every day here at Michigan. And the ability for real-time observation and intervention in people's lives is changing how we do governance, how we make sense of social problems we're trying to solve, and what we can do to solve them, supported by this massive data collection and by platforms. In my research, I'm very grateful for Bob Cialdini, Betsy Paluck, and others who talk about this idea of full cycle research, the ways that qualitative and experimental methods can support each other in both creating change in the world and through developing social theory. But where they might use lab experiments, I'm often doing large-scale data analysis to try to get a sense of an issue, use that to guide my qualitative research, and then come out of that research with novel field experiments and technologies that hopefully make a difference in the world and also help us expand our understanding of the world by developing and validating theory. Today I'm going to talk about 3 things, and we probably won't get beyond that. I'm going to share an example of this work, and then I'm going to step back and ask what it means to live in a society where this kind of behavioral science is incredibly common and becoming more powerful. I'm going to talk about the idea of citizen behavioral science and why it's so important in a democracy, and in all likelihood we won't get to this bonus round on AI law enforcement, but we'll see. So over the last year, I'm sure many of you have become very aware of the financial opportunities, opportunists, and also maybe state actors that have been taking advantage of online advertising systems to attract, profit from, and perhaps influence millions of people with inaccurate information. Of course, this kind of profitable inaccuracy predates these innovations. It's a sustainable business model for many tabloids who publish claims that are wildly popular, spread public fears that are rarely corrected. Like this story from January, the man was actually a Spanish national. He had a mental illness, and he was speaking in Catalan, not Arabic. But none of these publishers made corrections to the story. Managing this kind of inaccurate information is essential for democracy, which relies, of course, on an informed public. And attempts to study misinformation by trying to correct it have typically looked at individual perceptions and beliefs, trying to understand the role of fact-checking and other kinds of information processing. They've looked at the role of social context, of culture, of all of the structural factors at play that deliver misinformation to our lives and cause us to be more or less likely to trust it. But recently, we've become aware of the way that algorithms and other automated systems also have a role to play in the distribution and shaping people's understanding of information in democracy. And one great example of these algorithms would be news aggregators. If you opened up your phone this morning, probably the things that you read were shaped by maybe Facebook or Twitter or Reddit. This is just this past Sunday. And if anyone does want to follow up on this amazing animated GIF of someone diving into a donut, you should definitely check it out later. You see that these rankings are very different from each other because these systems all have different priorities and they pay attention to different things. So when a news link is posted to a site, there are a number of kind of bits of ongoing data that gets observed. People are clicking, people are voting in some cases, they're discussing a link. On some platforms like Reddit, they might be downvoting the news. All of that gets observed by a news aggregator, whose algorithm is, in almost all cases, some kind of trade secret, perhaps changing all the time, which then makes some decisions. Is it going to promote that news? Is it going to demote that news relative to the other items in the ranking? And then, of course, if it gets promoted, then more signals are generated because more people then react to it in some way. And we know that these systems can be incredibly powerful. Matt Solganic and Duncan Watts did this famous study where they reversed the ranking order of music recommendations. And they discovered that you could actually create a self-fulfilling prophecy where bad music becomes popular because it's ranked more highly on the lists. And we've also been able to see in other research by Taylor and others, Sinan and others, we've shown how early interactions to influence these algorithms can create these herding behaviors. Like, for example, getting in early and just clicking the upvote button once on a news article or clicking the downvote button once can have dramatic effects on other humans' voting behavior as it plays out over time. So in an era where these algorithms have a profound impact on what we're aware of, what are the things that we could actually do about it? How can we govern these systems? Well, one option is to step up the surveillance and the censorship to try to detect and shut down misinformation, like governments like China do, like in some cases European governments do around hate speech. People who want to expand and preserve civil liberties often talk about counter-speech and fighting inaccurate news or bad speech with more speech. But we have these algorithms, and there's this question about how do we do practical algorithmic governance. We're still figuring out even how to detect when they're doing the wrong thing. And there's a big question mark around how we actually, what levers we have to actually change what an algorithm does if we can't always control the algorithm itself. And then there are also some efforts at behavioral nudges. You may have seen, for example, Facebook's disputed tag, which when someone posts an article that's been fact-checked by a third party, they'll put up a note saying this is disputed, and they're hoping that it'll nudge people's behavior without actually having to remove the content altogether. But all of these ideas make the assumption, a classic assumption in governance, which is that if you're going to tell people they should intervene in some way, you need to know you actually can do it in a way that has the effects that you hope. So this need to actually observe and understand the effects of interventions. So how might this play out in practice? This is the subject of a study that I just recently did. I've already shown you about examples of claims that were wildly popular and inaccurate. On a platform like Reddit, there are a number of things might happen. If it's hate speech, you might report it, especially if it's in a European country. You could report it to the Reddit platform, and they have this lovely little report button there. You could also report it to the volunteer moderators who moderate different parts of the site. Or you could click on an upvote or downvote button, which is itself a kind of governance intervention that Reddit opens up to the public. Over the last 3 years, I've been doing a lot of qualitative research to understand the kinds of volunteer governance that people do. So these last two, everyday citizens who take some role in the governance of information. And I won't have a lot of time to go into the nuances of that work. You can read more there. A few things I do want to say, though, is that we've tended to rely on everyday internet users for the governance of our online communities since the very earliest days of the web. And it's still a predominant way of managing problems and shaping people's experience online today, from the early days of the well to today's Xbox, Enforcement United, Facebook group administrators, and Reddit moderators, who I've done a lot of research with. On a platform like Reddit, there are thousands and thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of communities that range from book clubs to job boards, places where people can get mental health support, the new Reddit journal of Science, which is mostly like academics, professors, graduate students, around 1,500 who moderate one of the largest public conversations of science in the world. And these communities are moderated by a massive number of volunteers who basically donate their time to be the creators, facilitators, the people who smooth over the cracks of social interactions online. On Reddit alone in 2015, there were at least 148,000 moderator roles. Not all of them were active, but a massive number of people do this work every day. To give you a sense of that, in a nationally representative survey, the Data and Society Institute found that nearly 100 million Americans have taken some action to intervene in cases of online harassment that they've observed. So when you stack that up against the maybe 7,500 paid reviewers that you get inside of a platform like Facebook, there's a massive role for everyday citizens that we often overlook. And it was just one of those groups that approached me about a year ago about this problem of misinformation. It was the World News discussion community on Reddit, about 70 moderators who manage a very large conversation about news from places other than the United States. And they had about 23 news discussions a day that were posted from these highly unreliable sources. And they wanted to know, can we cause people to question these sources and do further research to engage their critical thinking about sources that might not be very reliable without necessarily having to ban those sources outright. They wanted to avoid what they saw as censorship. But they were also worried about another thing. They were worried that maybe encouraging people to fact-check information might cause that information to trend. And here's how that would work. Maybe someone posts an inaccurate article. We might encourage fact-checking, and that would cause an increase in activity around those articles. As more people comment and discuss and get upset over this misinformation, it's possible that the news aggregators might notice that and then decide that that's a sign of popularity and promote the information further. This was a hypothesis that we had based on just observing what sometimes happens on Reddit when something controversial is posted and it attracts massive amounts of attention, gets to the front page, and you get even more firestorms around it. And so we realized what we were really wondering about is something that I call an AI nudge. We had this behavioral nudge around encouraging people to fact check that we wanted to test. But we also thought there might be kind of a second order influence on an algorithmic system that we needed to observe because it might cause incredibly detrimental unintended consequences. So here's how we set up the study. So we observed news articles as they came in, and when articles matched the list of publishers that the community had already flagged as frequently unreliable, in some cases we didn't do anything. In others we encouraged fact-checking. And then in a third condition, we encouraged people to vote. And I'll show you how we did that. So here's a message that we posted at the top of conversations where we were encouraging fact-checking. We asked people to help improve the thread by linking to media that verifies or questions this article's claims. And then in another message, and that would get posted at the top so that everyone who was reading or commenting on that discussion would see that message. And then in the alternative message, we added a sentence. If you can't independently verify these claims, please consider downvoting. And they had to be very kind of tactful in this language, because they also didn't want to be accused of advocating for vote manipulation. But we're encouraging these two conditions. And we also observed two kinds of outcomes. We looked at individual comments, and whether comments in some discussions and not others included links to evidence. And then we also polled the Reddit rankings every, I think it was 4 minutes, to observe the rank position of an article in the top 300. To give you a sense of what that looks like, here's just a random sample of 6 articles and their journey through the Reddit rankings. And this was the ranking within this community, not the site-wide Reddit rankings. So you'll see that articles start someplace. In some cases, they grow in prominence. That means they kind of move up the rankings. Here, a level of 300 means that you're at the very top item, and a score of 0 means you're off the rankings entirely. So some went up, and then that happened to them because they violated the community's policy. Maybe it was a duplicate story, for example. So then they would be removed from the rankings by moderators. And then some just didn't really do so well at all. And so we had some hypotheses going into this study. First, we expected that encouraging people to fact check would actually cause comments from people to include, or be more likely to include links to further evidence. And then we had 2 hypotheses related to the algorithm itself. The first was that encouraging fact check would actually increase the rank position, the maximum rank position of an article over 7 hours. But we thought, oh, there's this system for downvoting. If we encourage people to vote, inaccurate information will be pushed down over time. When we ran the experiment, here are the kinds of things that happened. I'm keeping quotes out of this just for privacy reasons. But people would reply to this message with links. They would say, I found these other sources. They would often make claims about whether the original article was accurate or not. And then often there was a discussion about whether people trusted those additional sources and how far to weigh the evidence that was shared additionally. So here's a summary table of some of the basic things about the study. We ran it from mid-December to February across about 1,104 posts. Not all of those posts had comments. And then not all of those articles, of course, were permitted by moderators, but there's pretty good balance in the sample. I'll come back to this table in a bit. We did find that encouraging fact-checking in both conditions increases the percentage of comments that include links, or the chance that a comment would include links using a logistic regression that was adjusted for things like cluster randomization and multiple comparisons. Not a huge percentage of comments include links, but we did increase links to further evidence. That kind of raises the possibility of us to then look at this issue of a second-order effect. We confirmed that we have a behavioral nudge on human behavior, but what about the effect on the system itself? So in the regression model we specified in our pre-analysis plan, using the open science practices, we did actually find a statistically significant effect from one of the interventions, but in the multiple comparisons that kind of fell out. So we failed to observe a statistically significant effect from any of those interventions. Now why might that be? One might be that there's no discernible effect, right? Straightforward, or we might not have had a large enough sample. But there are a couple of other possibilities. One is that rank position is dependent on the popularity of other articles at that time. So, an article in the 10th position today might be more popular than an article in the 10th position tomorrow, depending on the allocation of votes. There might be more votes tomorrow. And so simply comparing articles without accounting for those relative factors might have caused us to miss the true effect. And then, of course, there's interference from other treatments. You have multiple discussions that are receiving the treatment. They're all in the rankings. If in one particular moment you have more of them from the control group or more of them from one treatment or another, you could have these spillover effects. So to account for that, we have used some additional methods to get a more precise estimate of the average treatment effect. The way I did that was to take these individual time slices, these individual observations of the rank position at each of these 4-minute moments, and fit a linear regression model on the rank position at that moment. So going through and fitting over 100 regression models for each time slice. And here's what that looks like. This basic linear regression model predicting the rank position of an article at time t. Of course, you include the predictor or the treatments as predictors, whether the article was permitted by moderators, because of course that kicks it off the rankings, and then a number of other things. Reddit gives us this highly obfuscated score, which is supposed to be some measure of like the voting at that time for that article. So we look at the median score of other articles on the rankings at that time. That allows us to adjust for differences in the vote share at different moments in time. And then I also included terms for spillover from how many other treated articles appeared on the rankings at that particular time. And when you adjust for that, you get this nice chart. So this chart shows the average treatment effect of encouraging fact-checking in a discussion along with the confidence intervals for that model. For each of those time slice models adjusted for multiple comparisons. And you'll notice that my initial hypothesis was that encouraging fact-checking would increase the rank position of articles. But here we actually see that encouraging fact-checking decreased the rank position of articles by as many as around 24 positions over time across the 7-hour period. How did that work for the fact-checking plus voting condition? No discernible effect. So paradoxically, we came into the community and I came into the situation thinking that encouraging fact-checking might backfire and that we should encourage users to vote in order to ensure that we were pushing these inaccurate articles down in the rankings. But when we encourage people to vote, there might be a small effect there, but if there is, we certainly didn't observe it in our statistical tests. If any of you are interested, I also did some work to kind of characterize the kind of shape of the effect over time. Came into this with these assumptions. This was definitely confirmed, but this was completely wrong. Now, why might that be? Beneficially wrong, because we found out what actually works. Why might that be? One reason might be that the community and I expected that encouraging fact-checking would actually increase the number of comments received by discussion. We thought we would create controversy by encouraging people to fact-check articles. But if you look at the mean comments per discussion, the control group is about 60 comments. And when we encourage fact-checking, it's 12.4. When we encourage fact-checking plus voting, it's 22.4. So the direction of the behavioral nudge was the opposite from what we thought the direction would be on the kind of commenting volume. So that may be one reason. But there are a number of other possibilities. Moderators talked about how when we encouraged fact-checking, it seemed to reduce the number of complaints. So if the community moderators permitted an inaccurate article to remain in the past, they would get lots of comments saying, you shouldn't let this up, I can't believe you continue to allow articles from this source. And encouraging fact-checking directed people's energy towards actually something constructive, and they had less pushback, so that could be part of it. It's also possible that it could have kind of stemmed some of the just reactionary, prejudiced, kind of highly inflammatory conversations that sometimes follow on from articles from the ones that, like the ones that I shared, by directing the community towards discussions of the validity or veracity of the article. Those are all things for follow-up and qualitative analysis of the content. So, you know, this could be one of the reasons why we had an unexpected outcome. It could be reactance. It could be that when people don't like being told how to vote, and when you tell people to vote in a certain way, they vote differently. It's possible that the submitters of the articles, once they were aware that we're trying to influence the rankings by saying please vote, mobilized their friends. There's also another possibility. By encouraging people to take 2 actions, not just one, it's possible that introduced a time delay in comments as well as in ratings. And we definitely saw this in the case of comments. And we know that these algorithms are very sensitive to how soon a vote or a comment is made. That the older a comment is, the older a vote is, the less impact it tends to have on the position of something in the aggregator. So these are all possible explanations for why we might see an opposite outcome from what we were initially anticipating. So although the results were surprising, we still observed this AI nudge, the outcome of nudging human behavior on the subsequent behavior of an algorithmic system. And if other nudges of this kind can be observed, they might help us to grow our understanding of the world we now find ourselves in, where understanding behavior isn't just about studying individuals or context and structure, but really does relate to the interactions between humans and intelligent machines of various kinds. So that's an example of the kind of research that I do. And there are a number of values and debates that are underlying that. And I want to take a step back and think about what it means to live in a society where experiments of this kind are commonplace. Studies like our AI nudge offer powerful guidance for a society that's trying to manage the risks of combined human and machine behavior. And it's incredibly powerful. If you hold the reins to the ability to shape what people read when they get up in the morning, you can shift how society works. And so we need to ask this question. First, how can we govern wisely? And experiments like this help us collect evidence on the wise use of power. But we should also ask who should be responsible. I'd like to believe our study was beneficial, but that's not always true of online behavioral research. This April, a New York Times Magazine article accused the ride-hailing company Uber of pulling its workers' psychological levers. They hired hundreds of social scientists to generate massive amounts of evidence, and according to the article, used that knowledge to influence drivers to act against their own self-interest and in the interest of the company. And I want to give you a clear sense of the scale of this behavioral research. Having shown you just one study, inside online platforms, it's very common to start hundreds of new studies in a week. This is a chart from Ron Kohavi over at Bing from 2013, showing that by 2013, they were doing 300 behavioral experiments a day on Bing.com. And researchers that are working on experimentation infrastructures have integrated these systems into LinkedIn, Bing, Airbnb, many other platforms, and integrated it to become a basic part of the software engineering and design process, where you think of things like continuous integration for software testing. They're talking about continuous behavioral evaluation, where the timescale from one study, from thinking about a product to testing it, is 1.5 to 2.5 weeks, and you can do experiments that are based on continuous observations of thousands of variables. Those of you who've been inside of companies, this is like normal to you. But I think the public isn't necessarily aware that this kind of behavioral power is being concentrated inside of companies. And that concentration is something to pay close attention to. In a 9-month ethnography with Uber drivers, Rosenblatt and Stark described the information and power asymmetries that allowed Uber to use experimentation to exploit workers. The company has the power to govern, it has control over the tech, it controls the data, it can experiment. They have secrecy, it's not even clear to the outside world what they're doing. And what do Uber drivers have? They have a forum where they can talk about it and complain about it. And that's about it. And it's not just Uber. That's the natural state of affairs for all of us in our relationship to online platforms. And there are a couple of ways that people have proposed for ensuring the public good in a situation where power is being concentrated in these ways. I know many folks here have done a lot of work on research ethics and design ethics. There's work on accountability, and a lot of that tries to kind of bring greater transparency and accountability on this side. But there's also work to be done to balance out this information asymmetry, to put more information and power in the hands of the citizens. And that's the work that I've been doing with my research. I want to say a little bit about the historical background to this, because of course, this is not a new situation. Power through information asymmetry and the behavioral sciences has a long history. The use of experiments to manage human behavior began in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution. And according to Alfred Chandler, control through statistics quickly became both a science and an art. And the researchers who did this work were the very first management consultants. Now, not all of, there have been important voices to try to rethink the power and the role of experiments in society. And I want to name three of them. The first is Karl Popper, an Austrian exile and philosopher who wrote during the Second World War about two kinds of governance when in exile from Germany, from the Nazi regime, exile from Austria, excuse me. He talked about a closed society, a society where authoritarians govern and manipulate the public towards goals that they set on the paternalistic principle that the learned should rule, that people like you and me in this room coming up with what we think are the best ethics should govern society. And then Popper talked about open societies, where the public is encouraged to evaluate and criticize government decisions so that bad or incompetent rulers can be prevented from doing too much damage. And Popper was especially interested in the role of the social sciences in this kind of governance. He yearns for a way to reconcile the social sciences with democracy without resorting to Nazi-style eugenics, which was the version of information asymmetry he was thinking about. So he talks about two kinds of social engineers and two kinds of social technology, and he uses that word. He talks about the utopian engineer in a more authoritarian society who ignores complaints, suppresses criticism. For them, the path of research is very direct because they're doing the research, they're making the decisions, and they don't necessarily have to pay attention, or at least the public can't force them to stop. And then he talked about another kind of researcher, the piecemeal engineer, who's similarly trying to improve society, but does social research in a way that informs democratic processes of compromise and discussion and debate. So Karl Popper is one person who's trying to wrestle with the power of the social sciences and what it means for a democracy. A few years before Popper wrote The Open Society, the experimental psychologist Kurt Lewin was approached by the Harwood clothing factory, which did actually think that things like this were a good idea. The company was also struggling to understand its problems with systematic management. Like they were using all of the latest data-driven management techniques. They defined quantified worker tasks, tracked employee performance, gave them benefits, funded neighborhood institutions, but people kept on performing poorly, getting upset, trying to organize labor movements, and leaving. And Lewin, who was asked to study the situation and help improve these metrics, someone who himself had barely escaped Nazi Germany and Holocaust, called this data-driven approach to management autocratic and anti-democratic. But he wasn't against data. It wasn't data that would make factory, a school, or society autocratic. Writing from MIT in 1944, he drew a line between different kinds of organization, autocratic and democratic organization, and the different approaches to research that upheld those two kinds of organization. He argued that by using experiments to study the social forces shaping human behavior, democratic commonwealth could apply scientific investigation to its own processes of group living. And the way that Lewin and his students did that was to design studies that were actually created with the feedback and oversight of factory workers themselves. So they tested the outcomes of democratic management, but they also had the workers themselves set the goals, design the interventions, and he actually worked with workers to do the data analysis on these experiments. And that work at Harvard was one of the key founding set of research in the field of social psychology, in the field of organizational behavior, and has led us to profound advances in human knowledge and understanding. 2 decades later, we have a third figure, Donald Campbell, a founding figure of policy evaluation, who built on Popper's idea of an open society to imagine methodologically what that might actually look like. He'd written the book on behavioral research in the 1960s that the US government was starting to use to evaluate social programs as they computerized more and more of government administration. But Campbell worried that policy researchers might undermine democracy by concentrating power within government. So he proposed what he called an experimenting society, a hypothetical society, where participation in experiments would be a basic part of our civic lives, like voting, reading a newspaper, or even showing up to a town council meeting, also helping shape policy experiments. And in this imagined society, local people affected by policy would be the best critics, the best judges of an idea, guided by research that they helped develop. And that everyday citizens would have the power to use data and statistics to disagree and do their own experiments. And in his essay, The Experimenting Society, Campbell outlines some really elegant mathematical and methodological advantages of this kind of highly replicable democratic experimentation. Now, at the time, people looked at this and said, you're never going to be able to put the tools of data analysis into the hands of everyday people. The personal computer didn't exist, and so this may remain like a thought experiment. But maybe things have changed. To simplify, Popper set out this kind of binary of the open and closed society. Lewin argues that the people affected by an experiment should have real power in how that particular experiment is run and interpreted, also making arguments for the benefits to science. And Campbell is thinking about beyond individual experiments to imagine how communities can learn from each other through disputation, through networks of local policy experimenters who do their own research and share the results. So in the 1970s, most of those ideas seemed pretty crazy. Like, in what world would thousands or millions of people have access to the tools of data analysis? A utopian fantasy. It would never be, possible to have a citizen behavioral science. But as I pointed out, we've already in industry gotten to the point where people with maybe not a lot of social scientific training are able to do massive amounts of behavioral experimentation simply because there's an infrastructure built into how they work that allows them, that does the work of creating measurements, doing statistical analysis, coordinating the interventions, making sure their studies are valid. And the question that I've set myself in my research is to ask, can we take these processes and turn them into a citizen science that works for an open society? And that's the idea behind Civil Servant, which is the early stage experimentation system that was used to do the AI nudge research I just talked to you about. Civil Servant is both a process and a software that works with communities to co-design experiments. It coordinates the interventions, monitors the outcomes with the consent of the community. We do the statistical analysis, and then as studies are complete and communities learn about the research, they can do their own replications as well. The Civil Servant system operates independently from online platforms. We don't have to sign contracts, NDAs, or any agreements with the companies. And it operates with the consent of communities who invite our social bot into their online community. And if they decide to stop the study, they can always kick us out and we lose access and the study ends. We don't control that particular component. Super high-level diagram is that you have platforms like Reddit or Twitter, and we use the API to collect data with consent of users. And then we have a social bot that coordinates interventions and also manages research ethics. And the vision is that as more and more communities use civil servants to do studies, all of their results contribute to open knowledge and are shared back with communities and also to an open archive of results. So that we, in time, will be able to gain the benefit of replication and external validity through communities doing more and more of their own studies. Here's what the research process looks like. And something I'm, for now, calling the community knowledge spiral. So community will come to us and pose a question, like the AI nudges one that I shared. They will grant us access to their community, to some of their private data, and we'll then work with them using that data to design the study and both have a community review and, of course, a university ethics review. We'll then use the software to deploy the experiment. Sometimes the treatment is managed entirely by software. Sometimes it's prompting people to take certain actions. And then there's the kind of discussion phase where we report the results back to the community, debrief them about the study, and then support them to have a discussion about the decisions that they make as a community based upon what we learned together. You'll recall, coming back to one of my earlier slides, that a lot of governance online is managed by volunteer moderators who have to make their own community decisions about what to accept, what not, how to manage all of the problems that they might face. And we support those community discussions based on the experimental evidence that they generate using civil servant. And then, of course, as other communities are curious to try these ideas, we make it very easy for them to start up a replication. In principle, for a study we've already done, it really only takes a couple of hours to start a new study. Civil servants supports a wide range of experiment designs, randomized trials that randomize on different kinds of units like discussions, individual users, across time. We might get in between groups someday if there are enough communities that sign up. We do some observational analysis as well. Just added panel discontinuity designs, which are a multivariate interrupted time series, is one way to think about them. And in addition to the AI nudge, we've done work on preventing harassment, managing conflict and partisan discussions, different ways of thinking about banning or reintegrating people who violated community policies, and over time we'll be expanding to a wide range of further platforms. Civil Servant is being incubated as a nonprofit by the citizen media organization Global Voices, which is already organizing volunteers in 167 countries and over 40 languages, which will hopefully allow us to do this work across the wide range of cultures and contexts. And I want to mention one final thing, which is that I shared like 3 influential men from the social sciences in my talk. But underlying that work is deeply influential work to kind of sum up, critique, and make sense of these well-known figures by Anne Oakley, the feminist sociologist who's thought deeply and written about behavioral experiments in policymaking, the political scientist Eleanor Ostrom, who's deeply kind of written thoughtful ideas about the role of citizen science in society, and someone who many of you may know, Donna Haraway, who's thought a lot about situated knowledge in the ways that people who are in the shadow of powerful systems can create their own knowledge to expand their agency and use evidence in that work. So there are a number of ways to get involved in civil servant. One is to co-design studies with communities as the project goes. Use civil servant for a study of your own. This is clearly a slide I copied from my Princeton talk. I will be teaching a field experiments class in the spring. Sadly, it won't be here at admission. And then there are a few kinds of studies that communities tend to approach us about. Harassment, discrimination studies, public health research, facilitating meaningful discussions, social change questions, citizen mobilization issues, managing disputes and conflicts, organizing volunteers in meaningful ways, managing markets. On Reddit in particular, there are a lot of markets where people exchange goods. And then, of course, monitoring and influencing the behavior of powerful actors, whether they're employers, platforms, governments, organized hate groups. So those are some of the kinds of studies that we are hoping to do in the upcoming years, and with some support from the Ethics and Governance of the AI Fund and hopefully some other funders. We're growing the project, and our hope is to be able to support hundreds and thousands of citizen behavioral experiments a year by doing work that is collaboratively done with and accountable to citizen behavioral scientists. I'm going to stop there before I show the teaser part, because I imagine there are questions and many things for us to discuss. We may or may not get to that question. You can always ask me afterwards. Thank you.
So you mentioned that you always get consent for these experiments, right? So in the Reddit one that you talked about, how did you go about getting that consent from users?
Yeah, so there are a number of different consent models. Many of you will be familiar with individual consent, which is what we get from the medical literature. There's a really nice recent book that you may have seen, edited by Scott Desposato, on field experiments in political science, that works through different models of consent in cases where you may not necessarily be able to know who is going to wander into your experiment, or exactly be able to reach them. And one of those models is group or representative consent. And so on Reddit, what we often do is we work with communities that have shown an ability to hold their moderators accountable for the power that they exercise. And a lot of my qualitative research looks at this question of how moderators become moderators, how they're socialized into the role, and the degree to which everyday Redditors are able to hold them accountable for the power that they exercise. And so we tend to work with subreddits that have exhibited that kind of pattern. Many of them, for example, will elect moderators and have elections with hundreds of candidates that they narrow down. And we do the work with the, in all cases, with the consent, often votes of the moderation team. In many cases, we're also able to notify the community in advance and talk through the experiment design with the community, posting it very prominently so that anyone who browses that particular subreddit for several days will have a chance to learn that there will be an experiment, critique it, argue that it shouldn't happen, let us know about possible risks and harms. And we then decide whether to go forward with the experiment on that basis. Now, there are some studies where that is even difficult. And so one thing we're prototyping at the moment this fall is an automated debriefing system. So that if there is a study that, because there maybe is no group, we can still design systems that automatically notify everyone who's in the study that there was a study and give them a chance to opt out, which to date many people have considered to be impractical. But we're engineers, right? We can build this and we can find out how it works, how people make sense of it, whether it's a good idea or not. Partly, there's certainly the ethics debates and the kind of ideological debates we want to have, but we can ground those debates in evidence. So we're doing some empirical research on large-scale debriefing approaches in cases where there's potentially a public benefit to a deception-based study as well. Open area of research.
Hi, so I have two questions about how you're designing the studies.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, this is really interesting work. So you said that you talked about designing these studies with the community members, but what is it, how does that affect the results of the community members like know the experiment that they're in? And then my other question is like, designing studies is a really hard task. Like all of us have been going through like years of training to do this. Like, are there certain roles that you take on as a researcher, and that there are certain roles that the community members that you think that they can do well, and how do you balance those responsibilities? Because that's like a really hard task to get novices to do something that an expert is hired to do.
Yeah, so the question, I'll repeat it for the video. The question is about what does that process of co-designing studies with communities actually look like? And what kind of roles in that process are community members kind of more able to do and less able to do? So one thing I'll note is that when you look at the evolution of an experimentation infrastructure, some recent papers this summer that look at kind of where they start and where they end up, often you start out in this fairly bespoke process, and then you move more and more towards like an interface that anyone can use to design their study. And the research I'm sharing here, often we were either creating a bespoke study or based on the conversation with communities, altering, remixing some software we already had to make that possible. So we had a fairly involved role in the study design. This wasn't like give them an interface, they click a few buttons, study is designed. But what we did do was we had numerous consultations, and those consultations focused on like figuring out the issue the community wanted to take on, working out what the possible interventions were, which usually communities have a way clearer sense of that than I would as a researcher, because they're constantly in that environment. Again, back to what Campbell said, they're really good at designing, they're really good at understanding situations, having practical ideas for what to do. Also, on Reddit in particular, and I think in general when you have a large enough online community, there will always be a few people with some statistical knowledge. Like if you have a community with tens of thousands of active participants, someone who's part of that community will have had some kind of statistical training in some cases. And on Reddit in particular, where it tends to skew highly towards people who had some kind of college education, often we were finding our methodologies kind of challenged and refined by someone in the community who would pipe up and be like, you haven't adjusted for that like particular interference or that like particular variable that might skew your results. And so there are numerous cases where ideas about measurement, ideas about the validity of a particular design, ideas about modeling, actually came from the community and dramatically improved the research design. There's always this question about Hawthorne effects, or whether knowing about the kind of study in advance kind of biases the results. That's always a risk. It's a common risk for any field experiment. And we could go into a longer conversation about how we manage that. There are different parts to that. People who do lab experiments often think about the bias of just knowing the outcomes and all those unconscious things. People who do field experiments often think about kind of fairness issues around like allocation. And so, we could dive into different strategies for addressing each of those things. In some cases, there's also a potential bias from you do the study and then more people learn about it when you report the results, so do your effects persist afterwards. With the AI nudge study, we actually kept the study running for a few weeks after we completed the experiment to see if publicizing results would open the door for people to kind of gain what we were doing, and we didn't see that happen. I think that when it comes to generating theory in the social sciences, that's where Paluck and Cialdini's research cycle is really valuable. You can go back to that slide really early. Because I think people think about methods in isolation. And what we often find is that field experiments raise really valuable questions, but often there are all sorts of questions at the edges of like exactly why did this effect happen? And that's often where keeping the cycle going, like using that theories, testing those theories in the lab, where you have more control and a wider palette of research ethics can help you unpack some of those nuances in a context where you can like manage people's knowledge and study with greater precision.
You mentioned that the interventions are bot-based. I was wondering what support there is for, say, a community likes an intervention and would like the bot to continue running indefinitely after you've gone off for the lab is included or something. Not that I'm encouraging the lab to code, but what sort of long-term support do they have if they like an intervention?
Yeah, so the question is, what happens after the study is done and they want to actually deploy an intervention? On Reddit, most of the large subreddits have like the person or people who manage the bots. And often when we're designing a study, we're testing interventions that they're proposing, and so they're usually things that are within the scope of what they can reasonably expect to do. I've done other research we could talk about later on the utilization of research knowledge, where I do ethnographic and data analysis on how knowledge of these studies spread, how communities debate them, and the things that prevent them from implementing them, and technical capacity is sometimes one of those issues. It's certainly a decision the civil servant nonprofit is going to have to confront, where some people are going to want us to not just be a research organization, but also a governance organization, creating products that people use to manage their communities. But we'll have to figure out whether that's a mission we want to take up, what that does to the democratic ideals that we have. Again, there are advantages to concentrating power. You find a result that you think is helpful, you're going to want the power to deploy that and manage it. But that may have downstream risks for society. Especially, you might be the wonderful philosopher kings, but the next philosopher kings might not be so good.
I was wondering if across communities that you've worked with, you've noticed similarities in norms or rules that communities or moderators, communities agree that moderators can use to govern them?
So the question is about similarities across communities. So one of the things I did in this research was actually to map out the network of co-moderation on Reddit, and then follow how ideas about moderation propagate on the site. Because it's not enough just to do the research. If you care about supporting research in a democratic society, at least I felt an obligation to then look at how that research was used. And so one way that ideas about moderation spreads is through the relationship that moderators have with each other. And that's not just on Reddit. There are all sorts of conversation spaces where people who do this volunteer work find each other because they're facing all sorts of incredible challenges, from managing death threats and prejudice to trying to keep their gaming market turning over in the way that they want it to. And there are a lot of ideas that moderators kind of have built up through their own intuition and experiences on different sites that they're very confident in, and many of them may work very well. Having spent a lot of time in lots of different contexts, my guess is that we would expect to see very different effects in very different communities. And in parallel worlds, in say development economics, we've seen that for example, like incentive-based interventions, where you do a randomized trial in highly individualistic countries versus highly collectivist cultures, those effects are very, very different. And so I would expect to have incredible variation in these experiment effects in different communities, even on a platform like Reddit. And that's another reason for this citizen behavioral science approach. Because if more and more communities can do their own replications, rather than rely on evidence from a very different culture, there's the potential for them to gain that situated knowledge. There's my Haraway name drop. and also potentially grow our collective understanding of what works where and how to think about that from a social theory perspective. That really needs, this kind of approach to take off more, and we'll see how that goes in the next few years.
I think we are out of time, but wonderful, and thank Nate again.